Hi, everyone. Welcome to Poet to Poet. I'm Radha Marcum, and today I have the pleasure of talking to poet Rosanna Young Oh, author of The Corrected Version. Before I introduce you to Rosanna, I'd like to invite you to become a subscriber of the Poet to Poet newsletter on Substack if you aren't already. Just go to poettopoet.substack.com and subscribe for free. In it, you'll find interviews like this one, plus helpful ideas on writing and publishing books of poetry. So again, today I am thrilled to introduce you to Rosanna. Rosanna Young Oh is a Korean-American poet and essayist who was born in South Korea and grew up on Long Island. Her writing has appeared in publications such as Best New Poets, Harvard Review Online, Blackbird, The Hopkins Review, and 32 Poems. She has received honors that include scholarships from the Sewanee Writers Conference and New York State Writers Institute. Her poetry was also the subject of a solo exhibition at the Queens Historical Society, where she was an artist in residence. The Corrected Version is her first book. So congratulations, Rosanna, and welcome to Poet to Poet.
Thank you so much for having me.
So in the book's opening poem, you ask a really interesting question, which is, should I pretend my stories are untrue? And that seems like a really good place for us to start today, because I think it's a good place to start with poetry in general. For many poets, I think myself included, the world seems to want us to conceal something, and we just can't. We can't hide from our stories. So where did the poems in this book start for you?
Yeah, thank you. So that question, I think, touches on not, I don't want to say a struggle, but perhaps a challenge that I've encountered throughout my life. It's something deeply connected to the way I grew up, my upbringing. So my parents are first generation immigrants, and they run a grocery store. And growing up, even now, sometimes when I enter spaces that are so unlike the ones I grew up in, and they're very privileged spaces to be in. So I admit to that, especially when we're talking about literature. Um, I had a tendency to cover that aspect of myself. And that was true in school since I was younger, all the way through college and grad school. So when I was thinking back on my life, and that tendency I had, I thought that was the question I that was genuinely a question I asked myself. And the book, I think, is kind of just playing with that. What is the version of myself that I want to express, that I want to show people? And you're opening yourself up to judgment ultimately, you know? So I thought that was an interesting question to start the book off with, like you said.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's one of the things I look for in an opening poem. Oftentimes, a writer will pose a question to the reader in that opening poem or opening sequence that sort of informs a kind of pathway through the book, a pathway through the poems. And so I really appreciated that that question as sort of a guiding principle in which to enter the space of the book, which does give us so many different perspectives. Would you like to read maybe a poem for us to start us out to hear sort of what you're talking about in these stories and versions of stories and the version that you want to tell?
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you. So the first one I'm going to read is called "The Problem with Myth," and I think a couple of notes to consider is it's based on a Korean folktale, which is about an angel and a woodcutter. The problem with myth. In the story my mother tells, the angel never returned to heaven. The woodcutter stole her cloak of wings while she bathed by the mangroves and took her as she shuddered in the wilderness. They married, they had children. Such are the premises of womanhood. Out of childish greed, I liked this version where motherhood is a virtue. Small shouldered, my mother goes out and shuffles in, arms heavy with laundry, to ask my father what he believes. He disagrees with whose tragedy the story is. Hence the corrected version. The angel was to blame. The woodcutter was seduced, moonstruck. Love, breathed the moon, in a syllable of radiance as the cicadas sang, clinging to each other in the numbing light. Beauty justified the coveting, the rape of an angel, or woman rather. Eventually, she found the wings under their bed. Standing in the hush hush of the hourless forest, he watched her fly away above the garden.
Thank you. So I sense a little bit of irony, or at least, if not irony, a number of layers of meaning in that line, the corrected version, which of course is the book's title. What does it mean to you, and why did you choose that as the book's title?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In the beginning, when I first heard a professor had recommended the title, and I kind of resisted it at first because it's kind of too meta for me. But then I was thinking about it um, as I put together this collection. I started submitting, and this book is really about the the stories we live, and how we make those stories about our lives. And they're different versions. We're always evolving. And I think I wanted to highlight that. The other title I was considering while submitting this manuscript was Erasures, because I thought that highlighted the book's immigrant narrative more directly. But I think it wasn't. I don't know. I think the immigrant narrative, that also can be too simplistic a term. There are other things I'm really interested in exploring in this book. So the corrected version is really about, a person trying to tell her story. What is the right version? There are different versions of this person, of the speaker poet. So I thought that was more true to what the book was trying to do.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and that word corrected, I think, holds a lot of weight in those contexts that you were just bringing up, right? With the immigrant narrative, and I know poems in the collection sort of directly address these relationships with teachers or with fellow students, and so this idea of processing, sort of taking back that idea of correct into, back into the speaker or the poet, versus having correct be something that is dictated by the external world. That also seems at play in that title.
Oh, that's really astute. Thank you. I didn't even think of that.
So I'm just curious, maybe to back up slightly, can you share a little bit about the process of developing the poems for the book? Where did the poems start? And maybe where do poems start for you generally?
A lot of the poems, they started when I was actually an undergrad, and then I kept writing throughout my MFA program, my grad school program. Um, I started PhD, and then I left after a year because I wanted to pursue a different career path, which was something I never thought I would do. I always envisioned myself as an academic, and so there are 5 years of my life where I was. I'm sorry, just a second. 5 years of my life where I wasn't really reading or writing. I was basically really focusing on my career as a marketer in corporate America. I started writing them when I was a student, and um, as I kept evolving, as I kept growing older, my perspective shifted. I noticed looking back, when I was in school, I had a certain view of the world that was very I don't want to say privileged, but it's very, I would say I was nasty. You know, I really believed in beauty and all the ideals. I was very idealistic. And afterwards, after I left my PhD program, when I started working in corporate America, I'm a marketing exec at a Fortune 300 company right now. When I was building my career for like 5, 6 years, and I wasn't really writing anything, my perspective totally shifted. I was reading business books. I was interacting with a completely new set of people and ideas. And so I think so. And there's kind of a duality to the two perspectives, I guess, you know, that I had from being in school and just being in the real world. And I think that's really what the book is about too, the tension between the two. Um, yeah.
That's great. I mean, I think it's really interesting, like you said, to bring in even the perspective of something, sort of as quote unquote normal as, the business world. And, bring all of that to bear on what's happening in the poems. So I really enjoy actually hearing that influence on the development. So that, because many of us do have jobs that are outside of academia, outside of, quote unquote literary spaces. And to have this as an example of a work that was developed whilst also your participation in that corporate work world. I think that's really interesting and a good example for folks.
Thank you. Yeah, and I just want to say one of the core topics of the book is labor. And so that was something I didn't really write about earlier when I was in school. It's only something I started embracing and writing about meaningfully once I started working, you know? And so I hope the book, you know, reflects that.
Yeah, it certainly does. Yeah. Would you like to read another poem? Maybe Reading into the Fire?
Yes. Reading into the fire. Since no one else had closed his eyes, I kept mine open. In the distance, where a man had sat, a life-sized bulb of flames began to spread out petals, curled and thick like script. No sound came out, no muscle twitched. The scent of oiled cloth and flesh tattooed the street. Oh God, I read an anger in that heat, and how his body, disobedient, collapsed into its hollow. What came next to mind was not a prayer to invoke his flaking bones, nor where the ample smoke would go, but fitting his death to subtext. If fire heals the pain it brings about, if fire works from the inside or out.
Those last two lines, they're really, really, really powerful. And I think, am I correct in that did I read that correctly, that it's a sonnet of sorts? That poem.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
So that last couplet really being a place for emphasis. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
So I'm curious, how many, you said that the poems started when you were, did you say an undergraduate?
Yes.
So how many years did it take you, maybe from the time that those poems started to now, to having this book come out with Diode?
14 years is the earliest poem is 14 years old. But again, as I mentioned, 5 to 6 years, I wasn't really writing or reading. I was focusing on basically making a living. So I would say 9 to 10 then, when I was earnestly writing
Mm-hmm.
the book. Yeah.
Yeah. So long-term process. And I should say too that is really common among all of the first-time book folks that I interview. A lot of people will say, 10 to 15 years. So it seems like a really long time, but perhaps it is, but nevertheless, it seems important to the development of the work, like you were saying, having these other aspects of your life that then became part of the driving themes that are in the manuscript in the book. So I'm just curious, over those years, what changed? What changed along the way?
That's a really good question. Um, Once I left academia, I feel like I had a really strong reality check. Poetry is something that is sacred to me, and in grad school or academia, it's kind of taken for granted, and people knew they knew what it meant to put out a first book. You go into corporate America, and no one really understands that, and that was hard for me, because I think poetry is just it's really a key part of my life. So I thought, people would understand its value, but the value system when you get outside of academia into the business world, it's different. And I remember even in the thinking that had to change was in academia, at least what I found was I always thought if I put out a good poem or did good work, that was my way of contributing value. In business, it's really the results, your KPIs, or, how much, literally like hard skills, something quantifiable. And that was hard. That it sounds simple, but it's actually, it really, for me at least, it entailed a huge mind shift.
Yeah.
And in the end, it works out because I do have like the left brain, right brain kind of thing going on. I do like the strategy that I do as a marketing exec. It does balance out the creativity that with writing. So I worked out, but it took a while.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just sort of in it because I have a bit of a background in marketing as well. And so KPI meaning key performance indicator. And
Yes.
so that's sort of ringing a little bell for me, like, well, what would be a KPI for a poem? If there were one, what would that even be?
Exactly.
You know?
And exactly. And then there's like a human element to it too. Writing is such a solitary enterprise, and obviously you write it in a community, not a vacuum, but still the work is usually solitary. And then I'm as a marketing exec, day to day, I'm interfacing with people every day, all day, throughout the day. So there was that too. I had to change my personality a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so that brings up for me this question that has been really crucial in my own journey with sort
Hmm.
of having multiple identities, right? Essentially, between a professional identity, a work identity, and a poet identity, among the identities that we might have. And maintaining enough footing in that poet identity can be a real challenge.
Hmm.
Especially when we are building careers or are really immersed in this sort of all-encompassing, all-absorbing world of corporate America. um, it's easy, right, to sort of check email and be engaged and be the person that corporate space wants you to be, but to let go of that poet identity while doing that, it's always been a source of tension for me. And like you said, I think one of the things that has helped me to maintain that poetic piece is to be in community with other poets, other writers. So I'm curious for you, how do you maintain that, I don't even want to call it a part of your personality, but like that important piece of your life? How do you honor that, maybe on a day-to-day or year-to-year level? What did you do in order to stay engaged with the work behind this book?
That's a good question. Since I was removed from academia, I didn't really have anyone to go to. Like my schedule was all over the place. I would wake up eventually I started waking up at 5:30 in the morning, and I'm not a morning person, but I wanted to make sure that in order to finish this book, the best energy that I had went into it. And the only way I could do it was to work around my work schedule. So 5:30 in the morning, work, then at night I would write deep into the night. And had an accountability partner. I have a college friend who's not a poet, who's actually a fiction, who trained as a fiction writer. And I would just send him stuff, right? Not great stuff, but stuff, just to keep myself writing, and to hold myself accountable and keep that pressure and momentum going. So I actually didn't really have that, the writing group that everyone talks about. Now I have, for my second book, I'm very fortunate that this first book, it's introduced me to really lovely poets, and we're meeting on a monthly basis. We share poems all the time. So I'm very grateful for that. So for my second book, I'll have this writing community that I have.
That's great. Yeah, it is wonderful when the work in the world sort of gathers that community, whether through your publisher or through conferences or events. The book definitely can be that anchor piece that sort of regenerates community, if one doesn't already exist. So that's wonderful. How about outside of other writers? Do you have other sources of inspiration that keep you tapped into that poet self?
Yeah, so like newsletters, I read a lot of newsletters. I subscribe to a lot of newsletters, podcasts, Instagram. I'm kind of skeptical. I'm not on Twitter because it's too overwhelming for me, but I think some forms of social media can be really great ways to engage with that poetry community, because it's very active on Instagram and social media in general. So that's what I do. There are art museums. I really love art, and a lot of the book has ekphrastic poems. So those are the ways I keep myself engaged.
That's great. So I'm curious if you have a favorite podcast or two that you would recommend.
Um, I really like On Being by Krista Tippett. I like The Slowdown a lot too. Um, so those are a couple. Yeah, and
Yeah.
obviously I get introduced to new podcasts like your podcast, other newsletters. There's just so much, I guess, content and activity out there. I feel like I'm discovering something new every single day. So
Yeah, we are exceptionally lucky, right? That there is so much good poetry content out there. And I love both of those podcasts as well, Krista Tivitz and of course The Slowdown, which is now Major Jackson
yes.
hosting. Yeah, he's wonderful. I love listening to his voice and those voices, just for me. I love reading. I read voraciously, but to hear the voice itself, sort of that embodied language come through, even through a podcast, feels like, it feels like so much nourishment for my nervous system during the day. So I love that too. Are there any other aspects of the book that you would like for readers to know, just to sort of have a sense of what they might get out of it, aside from some of the things that we've named already.
Like a writing process or just like a topic or a theme?
Just thematically, like if you're really interested in X, Y, and Z, check out my book.
Oh, um, I think something we didn't touch on, but it's actually really interesting. It's appeared in my work. It's Buddhism.
Mhm.
I'm not particularly religious, but I really find Buddhism as a philosophy very fascinating. So I hope if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the Buddhist community or Buddhist thinking, you read my book.
Yeah. Is there a particular aspect of the philosophy that you feel called to bring out in your poems? A concept or I don't know.
I think Buddhism, what attracts me to Buddhism as a philosophy, it's the interrogation or the inquisitiveness and curiosity that it kind of instills, I think, in its practitioners. I think everything is so open-ended. And this idea, I mean, even something like reincarnation, there's, you just think about multiplicity and things evolving incessantly. There's no linear narrative in Buddhism. It's constantly evolving and it's kind of circular and nonlinear. And that to me is very interesting. Um, it's kind of anxiety provoking, to be honest, but I think as a writer, um, how it's influenced me is I don't want to say skeptical or pessimistic or cynical, but I always ask these questions, Um, and I think that's because of Buddhism.
Mm,
Yeah.
that's beautiful. Yeah, that curiosity and that open-endedness and those being essential qualities of any poem as
Hmm.
well. Yeah. Would you like to read one more poem for us?
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you. Okay, this one is called The Woman with Leaves for Hands. The Woman with Leaves for Hands. Nowadays, my father's mind comes and goes as the wind. During last night's rain, he watched the maple leaves turning from beneath the eaves and thought my mother was passing through. All night, the leaves turned, weaving themselves into arms, weaving until the woman he once loved and the tree, shaking before him, were one. He named her name, then waited. He still believes in the silk of her voice. It comes and goes as the wind, he said, that characterful wind. What should I have done? It was not the foggy cold I was afraid of, nor the strangers staring at him from the road. No, it was the mind repeating itself out of hope, a mind that inhabits the same metaphor over and over, populating the earth with talking winds and talking trees. In my mind tonight, my mother lies below the grass, too tired to speak. Her limbs are not maple, they do not move at all. Thank you.
Mm. It's just beautiful.
Thank you.
So, do you have any advice for poets who are putting together maybe their first collection? Is there anything that you wish you'd known earlier in your process?
I wish I knew how important it was to take care of myself physically and mentally
Mm,
because I think it's so easy. And I didn't think this way when I was in academia. I look back and think, oh my gosh, but I would do anything for a good line in a poem.
mm,
I would spend a month like coming up with a good line, and I would, and thinking, and I would put a lot of pressure on myself, at least, because I do tend to try to, maybe I'm a little of a bit of a perfectionist, but I would do anything I wouldn't consider a waste to spend 8 hours in my chair coming up with two lines. But you know, now that I've gotten a little older, there's so much life to experience. There's so much you could do outside of your room writing. And I wish back then I had known that, that time spent taking care of your mental health, your physical health is not time wasted at all. And living these experiences that you might not really see the poetry in them, but eventually it feeds into feeds your poetry and nourishes you. So I think looking back, if I had a child, I would tell her that.
Hmm.
Tell them that, excuse me. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really wise and not a perspective that we get very often, right? Usually the message is, work really hard, get up, super early and do all the things and achieve, achieve, achieve in poetry as in, professional life. Um, and you're right, I think we can really get ourselves into spaces, speaking personally, where it's difficult to regain our energy and regain our momentum in the poetry, in the work. We do require, like you said, that nourishment from, tending to the body, tending to the mind, allowing for space around the writing process is really, really critical. So I really appreciate that perspective.
Well, thank you.
So, in closing, how can people find you if you want to be found, and where can they buy the book?
Yes, so I am on Instagram, and my Instagram handle is Ro in NYC, ROOHINNYC. And you can also find me on my website, which is rosannao.com.
Right. Wonderful. Well, Rosanna, what a pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you so much, and congratulations again on this wonderful book.
Thank you.